Well, greetings to you. I was going to do a video for my subscribers on the possibility of gold revaluation. But my chum, Clive Thompson, has beat me to it. And I had a look at what he's got to say, and I don't think I could improve on it. So I'm just introducing it so you can have a look at it and make up your own mind. A major gold revaluation is not unprecedented. It happened in the early 1930s by President Roosevelt. And it's very important that you understand it and you understand why it might happen. I'm not saying it's going to happen, and neither is Clive. But just to keep you in the picture, if you are like me, a gold bug or a potential gold bug, or you're doing your best to protect your wealth from criminal lunatic thieves like Keir Starmer.
Hello, dear friends. My name is Clive Thompson. $184 silver. You must be thinking this is clickbait. Well, stay with me and I'll show you how I get to that number. You might arrive at a different number when you see the maths, but it is possible that silver could go to this figure literally overnight. And how is that possible? Well, I'm going to explain to you how this could happen. But let's start with a catalyst. What's the catalyst for such a move? So the real problem that we have with the United States at the moment is the huge value of the debt. There's a massive amount of debt coming due in the next 4 years, which has to be rolled over at much higher interest rates than previously. This can't continue indefinitely. It's not possible to continue taking on debt indefinitely without any consequences. Something has to be done. Let's look at something which is being considered by the United States, and that is the revaluation of gold. And I'm going to talk about that and why we see it. So let's start with the position of Secretary to the Treasury in the United States. It's the most important position in the country when it comes to the managing the finances of the United States. Based on the amount of money being managed, it's a position which is many times more important than Jerome Powell's position as head of the Federal Reserve. Secretary of the Treasury is literally the most important position in the United States when it comes to finance. So Scott Bessent is the current Secretary to the Treasury. Scott Bessent was sworn in as Secretary to the Treasury on January the 28th, 2025 this year. A few days later, in his new position as Secretary of the Treasury, he said the following words, and I quote, "We're going to monetize the asset side of the US balance sheet for the American people." Now, what does that mean? Well, for those who understand what the balance sheet is and what the assets are, there's one asset he must be talking about, at least everybody thinks so, and that is the most liquid and the most undervalued asset on the Treasury's balance sheet. And that asset is 261.5 million ounces of gold, which is valued by the Treasury at the statutory price of $42.22. That's a price which was set by law in 1972. So those 261.5 million ounces at $42.22 are worth $11 billion. So the questions everybody's asking, and I'll come back to all these questions shortly, but I'll read the questions out. 1, when will it happen? 2, what will be the new gold price? 3, how will it happen? 4, will they take my gold, just like they did in 1933? Will they confiscate it? Don't forget, 1934, 1 year after they confiscated people's gold, they raised the price from $20 to $35 an ounce, an increase of 69% in one night. How will it affect the price of silver and other precious metals? Now, that's what you want to hear about, and I'm going to talk about that. I'm going to tell you how I get to my $184 price. Will it cause a collapse of the currency and massive inflation? So I'm going to break these questions down for you one by one. Let's start with the first question. When will it happen? Well, there's not going to be any official warning. Those who are in the know will be sworn to secrecy. However, as is always the case, there will be many people involved in the planning, and the secret is bound to leak out. Someone will tell their partner will tell their dad, the dad will tell his mates at the next barbecue, and so on. And of course, dad's mates are all going to pile into gold. Pretty soon, there'll be a large group of people in the know who were never supposed to know. But you won't know, except you're hearing it here. You won't know when. Your only warning sign will be a rapidly rising gold price without any apparent reason. There'll be no accompanying story. No wars, no surge in inflation, no default. But the question is still when. Well, the button's likely to be pushed when the economy needs a stimulus. Or it could be pushed when some emergency action is needed due to some event, such as a Liz Truss moment. Liz Truss moment in the UK was a bond crisis, a gilts crisis, so it might be a crisis in the US Treasury market. The second question is, what will be the new gold price? Well, we've heard all kinds of figures from the current price of $3,300 all the way up to $150,000. The most popular quoted figure is $20,000 an ounce. I have my reasons to think that's probably going to be a little bit too high. I think the figure will be $15,000 an ounce. It's a guess. I don't have inside information. But $15,000 is about 4.5 times higher than today's price of $3,300. Now, each price has its pros and its cons. But any price, from the present price of $3,300 all the way up to the highest possible figure, is going to create a profit for the Treasury, and it's also going to create a lot of newly printed cash for the Treasury if it's done right, yet allowing the Treasury to keep the gold. And I'm going to describe in a minute how, with a little bit of accounting magic, the Treasury can create trillions of dollars of newly spendable money, which can eliminate the budget deficit for the next 2 years, can reduce government debt, and allow the Treasury to keep its gold. And that absolutely is possible. So we'll just look at how much cash will be created for the Treasury depending on what price they choose for the revalued price of gold. Now, if they choose to revalue it from the $42.22 statutory price to today's price of $3,300, very roughly, I mean, that might be a bit more, a bit less when you watch this, but that's the price today, 1st of August 2025. If they valued $3,300, the revaluation would create around $863 billion for the Treasury. Now, that might sound a lot of money, but unfortunately it's not even enough to pay off this year's budget deficit, so it won't go very far in reducing the debt at all. Let's take another price, this time $15,000 an ounce. Now, that's the price I'm thinking of. Now, that would generate $3.9 trillion. That's enough money to pay off this year's budget deficit, turn it into a surplus, and also make a surplus next year. And it would be enough to pay off maturing debt over the 6 to 9 months. So government debt would go down. But some people say, well, why not? Why $15,000? Why stop there? Why not $150,000, which would generate $39 trillion? And that would be enough to repay the whole of the national debt. There's a little problem with that because the national debt has maturity dates, and until it matures, you can't pay it off. But it's a fair comment. Why not $150,000? But in my case, I'm going to go for the $15,000 an ounce. I'm not against the most popular number of $20,000, which would generate $5.2 trillion, but I find that figure a little bit adventurous, and it might have unintended consequences. So that's why I've gone for a slightly lower level of $15,000 an ounce. So next question, how will it happen? Well, it's a simple 4-step process which will be undertaken to make it happen. Let's go through these steps one by one. One thing which is held by the Federal Reserve is something called a gold certificate. Gold certificates are an IOU from the Treasury to the Federal Reserve. It's an accounting receipt, not a claim for physical gold. it's the Federal Reserve has got the gold. So back in 1934, the Federal Reserve owned the gold, but by the Gold Reserve Act, which was organized by President Roosevelt at the time, the Federal Reserve was forced to sell all its gold to the Treasury at the market price of back then it was $35, and it received in exchange the gold certificate, which you'll see on the Federal Reserve's balance sheet today, valued at exactly 11, or give or take, $11 trillion. Now, there's something very important to say about these gold certificates. They are not part of the national debt. And why are they not part of the national debt? It's because the Federal Reserve cannot redeem them, neither for cash nor gold. They have no maturity date, and, very importantly, they pay no interest. So basically, it's non-repayable unless the Treasury decides to repay it, and it's perpetual. So let's just go through the 4 steps which are needed, one by one, to turn this gold certificate and the Treasury's gold into a lot of cash whilst allowing the Treasury to keep the gold. So the very first step is the Treasury can redeem the Federal Reserve's gold certificate at its face value. That's 11 billion, not trillion, billion dollars. So that will cost the Treasury $11 billion. And don't worry, I'm going to get to the silver price shortly, so stay tuned on that one. Step 2, the President can issue an executive order which changes the statutory price of gold to, let's say, $15,000 an ounce. Step 3, and this is the crucial step which is required to generate the cash and to generate a profit for the Treasury in the current year, to turn the current year's deficit into a profit. So in step 3, the Treasury sells the newly valued gold, now worth $15,000, to the Federal Reserve for $15,000 an ounce, and in exchange receives the value of that gold in newly printed electronic cash. And then the last step is exactly the same step, the magic step that they did in 1934. It's just a repetition of something which has already been done in history. And this can be done again by a new act of Parliament, by a new act of the government. In 1934, the act was called the Gold Reserve Act. So in step 4, the Treasury immediately buys back that exact same gold from the Federal Reserve at the same price as the Federal Reserve just paid, so there's no profit and loss for the Federal Reserve, and gives the Federal Reserve in exchange gold certificates, exactly the same type of gold certificates as they hold at the moment. Now remember, these gold certificates are not part of the national debt, and they don't bear any interest. They're irredeemable by the holder, they're perpetual, and they pay no interest. So what happens? The Treasury gets its gold back, and basically the Treasury is $3.9 trillion richer, which it can use to turn the current year's deficit into a surplus, and they'll be able to repay a lot of the debt which is maturing over the next 6 to 9 months, reducing the national debt. Now, here's the question which everybody's been waiting for. What will happen to the price of silver and other precious metals if gold is revalued to $15,000? So the gold market is worth $22.87 trillion. That's the circulating supply. The silver market is worth 1/10 of that. It's a very small market compared with gold. It's worth around it's worth $2 trillion, less than 1/10 of the circulating supply of gold. And the platinum market is even smaller. It's almost 1/10 of the size of the silver market at $257 billion. So gold is the big market, silver is 1/10 of that, less than 1/10, and platinum's nearly 1/10 of that. So what would happen to the silver price, and what's the maths? I'm going to look at that for you now. Perhaps just to give you some relative market caps, let's just have a quick look at some other assets which are circulating. So gold has a market cap of 22.87 trillion. Put that in perspective, Nvidia's 4 trillion, Bitcoin's 2 trillion, silver's 2 trillion, platinum is 257 billion, palladium is 214 billion. So the silver market is tiny compared with the gold market, less than 1/10 of the size, and the platinum market smaller still. So for the sake of this exercise, to work out what the silver price could be literally overnight if gold is revalued. And I'm going to make a few assumptions, and you can make the same assumptions or different assumptions to arrive at your own figure. So let's assume that, first of all, the President revalues gold at $15,000 an ounce, and therefore that means that the Treasury is standing ready to buy gold from all comers at $15,000 an ounce. A really good thing for the Treasury. They get a lot more gold with from effectively newly printed paper. So I think whilst there'll be plenty of people willing to swap their gold for worthless paper, the Treasury will be only too happy to take the valuable gold for paper which it can print like there's no tomorrow via the Federal Reserve. So I'm going to assume that not everybody rushes down to the Treasury to sell their gold at $15,000. For this exercise, I'll assume that 3% of people who hold gold decide to sell it to the Treasury or to someone else at the new price of $15,000 an ounce. Only 3%. And I'm going to assume that when they get that money, half of that money they decide to reinvest in other precious metals, specifically silver in this case. And then you've got to look at how many existing silver sellers will be selling their silver to these people who want to buy it. Well, I'm going to say only 10% of silver holders will be willing to sell. And now let's see how that would affect the silver price. So there's my assumptions on the screen. You can see what I'm assuming. So let's go through this step by step. So you can see on the screen what would happen, and you can see the maths. So assuming that 3% of the gold is sold back to the Treasury at $15,000 an ounce, that would generate for the sellers $2.97 trillion, or let's call it $3 trillion for simplicity, in cash. And we're going to assume that half of that cash will then find its way into the silver market and be invested in silver. And we're assuming that only 10% of the people who own silver will sell some. So what we then do is take the amount of silver ounces which will be sold. You can see the maths on the screen. Take a screenshot if you want to. Amount of silver being sold, we'll take the total cash available divided by the number of ounces of silver which would be sold, and we see that we arrive at a price of $184.50 an ounce. Now, of course, there were three assumptions in there. We're assuming that 3% of the gold is redeemed for $15,000 at the Treasury. We're assuming half the money goes into silver, and we're assuming that only 10% of silver holders decide to sell their silver. Change any of these parameters and you'll get to a different number. But I think that's a good guess at $184.50 per ounce. Now, the last question we've got to ask is, what would happen if they do this exercise? Will it cause a currency collapse? Will there be massive inflation? In my opinion, it's very unlikely. So goods are not priced in gold. Services are not priced in gold. They're priced in dollars. And after all, the gold price has nearly doubled in the last 2 years, and it's had very little effect on the prices at all. The reason prices go up is because the level of government debt and the amount of cash in circulation is rising, and that causes a general rise in retail prices and also causes a general rise in the gold price. But the gold price on its own going up won't cause retail prices to rise. They're not connected. I mean, and we've seen that as evidence. We've seen the gold price has gone up and up and up, but it's been going up because of the extra debt and the extra cash in circulation. It's not been the gold price which has been dragging up retail prices, consumer prices. And let's just put the this into perspective. This exercise would generate $3.9 trillion. To put that in perspective, it's not much more than the annual budget deficit, which will now be a surplus because of what we've done, but the annual budget deficit is about $2 trillion a year, which means the government would normally have to borrow $2 trillion a year to service that deficit. That's money they won't need to borrow, and they'll have surplus out of that 3.9 million. They'll have surplus cash with which to redeem maturing debt over the 6 to 9 months. So we're actually in a situation where government debt is going down. That's actually not the sort of thing which pushes up the price of goods in the shops. Of course, there might be some minor effect because we've effectively got 3.9 trillion of cash coming into the economy, but it's not much different from 3.9 trillion of debt growing anyway. So what have we done in this exercise at the end of the day? Gold certificates, which are not redeemable, pay no interest, and are not part of the national debt. Plus, the government's got 3.9 trillion of cash to spend. They've kept all their gold. It's still where it's never moved. This is going to be terribly stimulative for the economy. It's good for the economy, and it will most likely push up other asset prices like the silver price, but of course equities and so on could rise as well, but it's not really going to affect the retail price or anything like that. I mean, let's just take one last comment. 3.9 trillion being raised is less than the price of one company on the New York Stock Exchange. I'm talking about the company Nvidia, which has got a market capitalization of more than $4 trillion. So it's not a big deal raising 3.9 trillion in cash. So, ladies and gentlemen, I hope you like this video.